You're okay about going having live stream, aren't you?
Sure.
Yeah, I'm just setting it up. Just a second, and then we can
How
start.
do you like my fake bookshelves?
Is it fake?
Of
Looks
course,
totally real.
yeah. Behind it is probably a bunch of dustbins and
It looks totally real. You
yeah.
fooled me. Okay, let me just see that we're live. Oh. Something's not quite working. Just a second. Oh no, we seem to be live. Okay, not now. Cat's trying to get on my lap. That's very inconvenient timing. Let me just check if we are. Oh, let's just start and I'll check it while we're live. Okay, start webinar.
You're obviously skilled at all.
Sort of. I've done it a few times. Good evening, comrades. Welcome to our latest session in our series Abolition. We're very pleased to welcome Marxist economist Michael Roberts, who's blogging on the next recession. His blog is called. Very, very interesting. I recommend anybody to go and read it. He will be talking tonight on money, about money. Where does it come from? What does it serve? What usefulness it has? Why has it been introduced? And how could we get rid of it within, remaking society? So without further ado, thank you for joining us, Michael. And I think you're doing a slideshow as well, aren't you?
Yes, Tina. Thanks for the introduction. Welcome to those who are watching, but I want to talk about the nature of money, how it is emerging, its role in modern economies, and whether we need to continue with money. If we move to a socialist society or a new form of human organization, will money continue to exist? And if not, why not? And how can we? How would it disappear or be abolished, as the title of this particular series of seminars is on? So I'm going to present you a few graphs, which I like to do. So I'll see if I can share those now. There we go. Oops. So money. Let us consider the nature of money. Why money? Why does money exist in human societies? Well, it existed before capitalism, so it's not a product of capitalism, which is a system of production by human or social organization, production for profit to sell goods on the market. Money existed before that, and before capitalism became a dominant mode of production globally. It emerged really once things and services that people use in one community, could be a tribe, could be a region of community in general, produced enough of that, and they wanted to exchange for goods that they don't have themselves, services that they could get from other communities nearby. So there's a process of exchange takes place. I'll sell you my cows, you sell me your wheat, or exchange them, to be more exact. And that process of exchanging wheat and cows obviously has to be estimated, the amount of value involved in each of those exchanges from the community. How much wheat do you get for how many cows? So in order to make those exchanges, it's very cumbersome to do it by cows and wheat. It was necessary to look for a universal measure of value, which everybody accepted that would be useful to exchange. So that, for example, in all sorts of societies, various sorts of universal commodity came to be adopted. They could be, in some societies, cowrie shells. They could be animals. But in generally speaking, they've turned out to be the most common universal measure was either gold or silver. And the reason that gold and silver became the dominant form of money, universal commodity that could be exchanged, was because gold and silver does not perish. They don't perish. Doesn't matter what the weather is, doesn't matter whether you're in rain or in deserts. the object you're using to exchange with another community in order which they accept, it doesn't have to be something which disappears at all. So the value embodied in the production of gold or silver did not alter, and therefore it had a basis for exchange which everybody accepted. It could then become not only a unit of account for exchanging, but also a store of value, because gold doesn't perish, so you could store it easily without losing any value. So in the beginning, development of a universal commodity which allows people to exchange and accepted by different communities to exchange commodities, and over hundreds of thousands of years you get to the point where in modern civilized human society, which is really only about 25,000 or 30,000 years, you start to get a commodity which doesn't lose its value and doesn't perish, so it tends to be gold and silver. So the value of a cow will be determined by a certain amount of gold, which will be determined in itself by the amount of production time it takes to produce that certain amount of gold. So gold becomes the measure of all other values. Money does not have value itself. It only has value in the value of the commodities which it can be exchanged for. Marx argued that the value of commodities comes from human labor. There's no value in any commodity unless it's produced, and it has to be produced by human labor and nothing else. So even with nature in its raw, unless human labor applies itself to nature in the forest, the water, and so on, and creates from that raw materials that can be used in production and the use by humanity and human organizations, then that's what sets the value of commodities, how long it takes to produce a certain commodity on average over time. The money, gold in this case, and silver as a commodity becomes the universal measure of that socially necessary average labor time to produce the commodity. But so money doesn't have value in itself. It's a bit like, if you want to think of it this way, money is a measure of length, like a meter, but it doesn't have length itself. It measures the value in other commodities related, in this case, to money, commodity, gold. So gold contains the value of labor time taken to produce it, and it uses that amount of labor time to measure the value of all other commodities against its value as a commodity. So that is the basic nature of money to begin with in human societies. From exchange, finding a universal commodity that can operate and is acceptable in all forms of exchange between communities for different products, and becomes the measure of the value of those commodities that are exchanged by different communities. And so it starts off, if you like, with gold and silver. These can be organized, mined, and then formed into bars or ingots. Of course, bars and ingots aren't very suitable for everyday exchange transactions, and therefore it's necessary to melt them down, and eventually states or even private organizations began to mint them as coins, turn them into coins, gold or silver coins, with the varying degrees of quantity of gold or silver in them, because they mixed other metals in them, depreciate the actual value of the coin. But gold or silver coin becomes the means of daily exchange mainly in pre-capitalist economies. So if we look at archaeology, the coins that presented to us over tens of thousands of years by various communities around the world, and in particular by the chiefs or controllers of those communities who have coin minted, often with their own picture on them. Local states and communities then mint their own coins, which varies, as I say, in the content of gold or silver. So that led to exchange rates between coins. So if you've got a Roman coin that was mainly silver or gold, and you exchanged it for a coin in a German tribal area, which may have a different level of gold and silver in it, these things have to be weighed. That's why you got the weighing transactions. And the exchange rate between a Roman coin and a German coin will therefore set the value of that for purchasing and exchanging commodities. But of course, as human organization becomes more complex and expands greatly, production, trade expands not only domestically, but even globally, you can't go on using just even gold or silver coin. There just isn't enough of it and it would just drive up or hold back the development, trading, and production if you only use the existing amount of gold and silver that you could mine. And that would increasingly rise in price because it's more difficult to mine as we exhaust the possibilities for gold or silver mining. So eventually private banks and even governments moved beyond coin into printing notes. So we have notes of currency, dollars, euros, pounds, as we have now, cash, as we like to call it, but that cash means coins and notes, and with higher denominated amounts of units of account, generally printed as notes. So these notes become acceptable as the universal equivalent, the money. But of course, they don't contain any particular value at all in terms of, even in relation to the production of time taken to produce gold or silver. It costs hardly anything at all to produce a piece of paper that represents, say, $10 or $100. But nevertheless, they're accepted as a measure of value in exchange, and also as a store. So you can put your cash into the banks, and banks hold it in the vaults, or you can put it under your mattress if you don't want to use a bank. So, but it retains its value as a note. And eventually, to reduce the risk of default by private institutions, so that they produced paper money, which they did. It's not just governments to begin with, but all kinds of private institutions did so. You could accept paper money from a bank, a private bank, or even from a company as a promise to pay either in gold and silver if it was set against the gold standard, or simply to pay in another form of currency. Eventually, states took over sole control of the issuance of notes and coin, because that stopped the sort of fraudulent practices, or at least they hoped did, operated by private institutions who refused to meet the promise to pay on the coin or on the note. So money becomes at that point a commodity that is no longer a physical commodity, but a state, or what is called a fiat money. It's a unit of account in paper or coin, or in credit, as we'll see in a minute, which is a promise from the state that it will meet a certain amount of value if you use that unit of account or currency. Because in a modern capitalist society, and that's where we are now, this nature of money capitalism started to be dominant mode of production in the 19th century globally, and indeed was the consequence of the rise of the industrial and global capital internationally. And as finance capital grew in importance, notes and coin became secondary as money to digital accounts. So now we have bank accounts with the stroke of a pen or computer, increasingly online on the internet, but even before that, by going to the bank and just or filling out a form, money could be transferred, recorded, and stored without the exchange of notes and coin. Banks did it eventually by electronic process, or by writing pieces of paper to share between different banks. So the transfer of funds took place without the movement of notes and coin. So we have digital money. And this has been with us now really for 100 years. There's a lot of talk in the 21st century about digital money, but it's been around a long time. The way in which digital money operates and circulates has changed, of course, and increasingly I can now send you all a fiver from my bank account transfer if I so desired, seeing I knew your accounts within a moment. And before this little session is over, you'd all be richer in your bank account if I did that digitally. So increasingly, we're moving to a cashless economy. With the rise of digital money in the form of bank transfers, credit cards, cash is diminishing in monetary transactions across the world. Indeed, money is now mainly digital in everyday transactions, and even mostly in international capital flows as well. Although as a store of value, surprisingly, but inevitably, gold money remains as an important share of national government reserves, because it's a physical commodity which can be stored and is not subject, the hope is, to too much volatility in terms of paper money or digital currencies as they flow. But as we've seen only in the last month, even gold money as a physical commodity does not protect its value if the people holding that gold reserve can steal it, which is what the Americans and the Europeans have done to Russian gold reserves. They have pinched them and taken them into their control, as they did with Venezuelan gold reserves and so on. So this important share of national government reserves is also subject to fluctuation or seizure by governments. And as you can see on this graph, I can show you that cash usage is disappearing fast. 2010, this is the amount of cash used in total transactions in countries where they're worried about their own currency being worth anything at all, and they don't want to leave it in banks. You can see there's still a very high percentage of people in 2010 were using cash rather than any digital process or credit cards. Even in those countries, that's begun to decline. Where China had 99% of transactions in 2010 in cash, that's now only 41% in 2020. And we see reductions in all those emerging economies. If you look at the more mature markets, we can see a dramatic fall in the level of cash usage. Notice Japan is still backward in this area, 79% in 2010 and now 54%. So nearly half of all transactions in China take place without cash. But if you go right down to the most advanced digital process, Swedes, only 9% of all transactions in Sweden are now with cash. Everything else is digital, through the bank transfers, through credit cards and so on, and even lower in the Netherlands. So cash is disappearing. So we've gone from gold and silver coins and coinage in general to notes. Notes are now beginning to disappear as well virtually, and we're moving towards a digital currencies across the board. So that brings me to looking at some of the monetary theories that are presented to us in the 21st century as a result of this process. But first, let me just deal with this important question about, does money have to be a commodity? Does it have to be a physical commodity? Now, there's a lot of argument amongst socialists, or at least amongst Marxists, that it does have to be a real physical commodity, gold or silver. Otherwise, it doesn't, and the value taken, and the time taken to produce that gold or silver sets the value of that money. And without that, everything doesn't have any clear position on how much value there is in it, in the production of anything. So is that the case? Is it true that Marx's monetary theory would not be valid, namely that money is the universal equivalent of all the value of commodities that are being exchanged, and it operates as a universal equivalent, and therefore measures the value of commodities by providing that universal service? But does it have to be tied to the value of gold production as it was at the beginning? As was said before, money has no value itself. It merely represents or measures the value of human labor time embodied in the commodities. So in my view, a Marxist theory says that money does not have to be a commodity, a physical commodity, to operate in this way. So just as long as digital dollars or euros represent accurately the value of the labor time in commodities. But of course, non-commodity money is then no longer anchored to a universal commodity physical like gold, and therefore really depends upon the issuing power of the nation state, or to a limited extent international agencies like the IMF and so on. So that means that the amount of money issued by a national government, printed, if you like, we still were, because it's not printed anymore, it's a digital reproduction. That quantity of money can become out of line with the out of value of the commodities that have been produced over time. So that can lead to a difference between the value of different currencies, euro versus dollars, yen versus renminbi, the Ukrainian currency versus German euro. All those can vary because no longer does it depend upon an actual physical commodity and how much labor time has gone into it, like gold, but now it's under the control of the state, and they can print as much as they want. And therefore, that raises the question of the value of that currency relative to the value of commodities produced. And in other words, you can have currencies depreciating against each other, or appreciating, and you can get inflation, so that you need more money to get the same amount of commodities because it's no longer representing that amount of value of commodities because it's being printed without any sort of anchor to a universal physical commodity. But it still provides the basis of a measure for value. Now, the modern monetary theory, which is floating around the labour movement in the last 10 to 20 years, is a theory which argues that actually money is not what does not emerge, as Marx suggested, through the exchange of commodities between communities and becomes a universal equivalent. It's in fact, from the very beginning, the product of state production. So we've just seen that the state can produce a unit of account, it can mint gold, it can mint various coin, it can print notes, it can produce digital currencies. The state controls the issuance of the currency, and therefore it controls money. It can produce as much money as you like. So money is not the product of the exchange of commodities, and it's not tied to any law of value within those commodities that sort of drags it into place like gravity. But money can be printed to any length of amount you want, and is really the causal force behind the value of all other commodities. So modern monetary theory turns Marxist monetary theory around the other way. Instead of saying, as Marx would say, money is the measure of the value of commodities in exchange, a modern monetary theory says that the value of commodities in exchange is measured by the printing or the production of money. It's the other way around. So now we have in MMT theory, or modern monetary theory, a fictitious world, if you like, where the state can issue debt, issue money, and convert that into productive capital to the level that it feels it wants to do so. So in other words, MMT argues that the state creates and controls money, and this is good for us in the labour movement because that means we can oppose austerity. We don't have to have cuts in public spending. We don't have to have wage cuts. The state just prints as much money as necessary to deliver the service, to allow the state to produce all the goods that we require, or to buy the goods from the private sector, which is primarily the position, of course, under capitalism. And it can raise wages as it sees fit by printing more money. Immediately you think about that, well, you think, well, it doesn't sound likely, does it? But we can come back to that in a moment. And the other side of the coin in the 21st century, to use that word, is that the development of cryptocurrencies. These are digital currencies which do not involve state issuance of money. They're supposedly money which are created by computer decisions in a decentralized electronic payment system. It's digital, so that the Bitcoin is not the production of any particular state entity. It is a coin that's developed through the exchange and a computer exchange taking place on electronic payments, through working out the value of that through the production of through a chain of computer decisions being made across the world. And you see up here is that we use big computers to mine Bitcoin, to produce a Bitcoin, which is basically a computerized piece of currency. But is it money? Well, as far as I can see, most of us don't use cryptocurrencies to buy what we need to survive on a daily basis. Cryptocurrencies really have been reduced just to being another form of financial asset. So if I want to speculate in stocks and shares, or in government bonds, or in currencies, one of those could be cryptocurrencies. So cryptocurrencies have become, there are various ones, they've become a source of financial speculation, but they're not money because they're not circulating to provide the universal equivalent for the exchange of goods and services across the world in a manner in which we could use them on a daily basis. Although, of course, the hope is that they will provide an alternative to existing state money. I see today that President Zelensky of Ukraine has said that cryptocurrencies will be made legal in Ukraine. The president of Nicaragua did something similar recently, and also the president of Nigeria, so that you can buy and sell and purchase whatever you want or sell whatever you want in a cryptocurrency, whichever one you want to choose, Bitcoin and others, in those nations. But I'm telling you now, that is not going to lead to cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin becoming the universal form of exchange of commodities in those countries. It will remain more of a speculative thing, attempting to avoid, as it were, the collapse of its own currency. People are going to buy cryptocurrencies because they don't want to hold a Ukrainian currency anymore, or they don't want to hold other currencies that the state's operating in. But that will probably not be a successful way of expanding transactions in Ukraine or anywhere else. So do we need money? Can we get rid of money? Do we want to get rid of money? Let me just explain how Marx would see it. He says that, look, if we have communism or socialism, it's a system run by freely associated producers and their communities, socially unified with necessary conditions for production, by definition means that there's no commodity exchange. Things will be produced to meet social need. So, and I'll go a bit more in what that means in practice in a minute. But things are produced for social need. They're not produced for selling on the market, for exchange of commodities to get money. They're produced to meet social needs. So it's a process of production directly to meet social consumption. Excludes commodity exchange. So basically, it also excludes money. There is no need for a universal commodity that we can exchange between different commodities, because production will be straightforwardly to meet the social needs of the people involved, whether it's things or services. So along with, for example, labor power, which is turned at the moment into a commodity, we get wages, we get money for our work, that would disappear. Labor will be done without getting wages. People will produce the goods and services that a community requires, and that would be distributed. The money, not the money, but the value produced by workers in that situation would then be distributed according to the democratic decisions of that socialist community, those associated producers. And we'll discuss, if I can briefly, what sort of things that means. So there'll be an investment in various things by the use of that labor power. I mean, if human labor in that community concentrates on producing hospitals and medical equipment, then they produce hospitals and medical equipment. They don't have to buy those things. They're produced and available by society, and they're distributed for use by that society. So during the development of such a social society, the producers may find that beyond certain basic needs, and I'll deal with that in a moment, they still require other products which are not produced on a big scale. And perhaps they will get instead vouchers for their work, and then they will decide beyond a certain level of supplies produced socially that they could use these vouchers, which represent the amount of labor time they're involved, to gain certain things from services or things that are available. So these vouchers do not circulate. You can't move them to somewhere else. You can't exchange them for anything else but whatever is available in the social production of that community. So when a cooperative society is based on a common ownership means of production, producers do not exchange their products. Just as little does the labor employed on the products here appear as value of the products. The material quality now possessed by them is in contrast to the cooperative society. Individual labor no longer exists in an indirect fashion, but you produce things for society, and the social administration of those things and services you produced are then redistributed back to you. Let me see if I can expand that a little more so you can understand what we're getting at here. So where could we start with things that could be produced without exchange altogether? Well, in capitalist economies, we already have things which are produced without exchange. Look at this comment on primary social needs. We have housing, mostly using money, food, mostly using money, some energy, not using money, but mostly is, but we have health in some countries, which doesn't require money. It's used at the point of production. So you go to the hospital, you don't pay money. You go to the doctor, you don't pay money. You go to school or college sometimes, and you don't pay money. Unfortunately, all of these things have been worn down in recent decades, even in the advanced capitalist countries. You can get communications without paying money. And you can get media, broadcasting, and so on without paying money. So In a socialist society, that would be the first thing we could do. We could, all the production of human labor power would be concentrated to producing housing, food, energy, transport, health, education, communications in a social context, controlled by the administration of those of society, and they would be delivered to people directly. So you would get free housing, you would get free food to a great extent, you would get free energy, you get free transport, you get free health, you get free education, you get free broadband. After all, only a few years ago, the Labour leader was advocating free broadband. Not a difficult thing to introduce at all. We get free media services, important social needs to enable society to function at the very basic level. But even at a secondary level, we could gradually move as we increase production and reduce the scarcity of products and concentrated our human labor resources sufficiently. You could move to more secondary personal needs. But these ones would still require an exchange for purchase through coupons or through money, like drinks, fashion, leisure goods, personal vehicles. But some of those things you wouldn't need if you wouldn't need personal vehicles on the whole. If you've got free transport, you wouldn't need lots of other things. If you've got free health, if you've got a range of basic foods that are free, you wouldn't require some of these other things. But if they're specialized things that particularly appeal to you as a person and are being convinced by advertising, which of course we will abolish, that you wanted a particular sort of whiskey, then maybe you would have to use some of your labor time that you've earned to purchase that, possibly through coupons or money. And so that wouldn't disappear. There would still be an area where money would operate for the exchange of these commodities. And of course, if you insisted on having a Lamborghini with your labor power, or you wanted several houses with acres of land and a beach and a private jet, then clearly you would require, under a socialist economy, a lot of your labor time, and you'd have to purchase those things through coupons or money. But as you can see, when you think about that, most of those things would disappear from the process of production because they would not be required by the mass of the population, the many as opposed to the few. So money would not be abolished immediately, but it would, over a period of transition, as you went through into a socialist economy, gradually as scarcity was reduced and confined to less essential goods, that will reduce the role of money, and as a whole, and non-price goods and services will become more numerous than goods and services bought on the market. So, as I say, with basic social needs, you'd move on to wider social needs, and increasingly, production will be for direct consumption. So, decreasingly, the idea of money as a universal commodity for exchange of commodities in the market will begin to disappear. You wouldn't abolish money overnight, just as you wouldn't abolish the state overnight. It will be a process of slowly disappearing, or if you like to use the Marxist phrase, withering away of the state, would also apply to the withering away of money as a necessary aspect of production and consumption in a socialist society. So there we are. That's a brief discussion of how money emerged, how it's changed in its form, but without changing in its content, and how, because of its nature, at least from Marx's view, as a universal commodity for exchange, then if you don't need exchange, exchange disappears, then money would also disappear at the same time.
Well, thank you for that. That was a tour de force through the history of money. That was very interesting. Thank you very much for doing that. Well, there are lots of questions and comments in the chat, and I'm sure comrades have different issues they'd like to discuss. Can I ask you one thing though first? Cryptocurrency, I find that quite fascinating. It seems a very nebulous, dubious kind of way of making, to do something with surplus capital, I guess, for many people. But for others, it's also like Julian Assange. I don't know if you've seen that. He's raised $55 million for his defense through cryptocurrencies and NTF, which is, I think, is quite linked to that. It's not actually real. It's just totally fictitious. Can you pay your lawyers with that money?
Well, if lawyers are prepared to accept it, then it becomes a sort of a brief form of money. But and if they accept it to the people that they can use the cryptocurrency for, then it's operating as money. But the vast majority of cryptocurrency operations do not operate like that way. They operate simply to make money, not to use it as money. So, for example, if I've got $1 million and I don't like the look of a government bond, or I don't like the look of Amazon stocks to buy with my $1 million, which is something I do every day, then maybe what I might do is buy some cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin. Why? Because the cryptocurrency Bitcoin might go up in price tomorrow, and then I can make a killing. So basically just an operation of trying to make capital gains through speculation. The amount of people and the amount of transactions being done to get services and things like Julian Assange was a service, which is legal defense, to using cryptocurrency is going to be tiny indeed. And in fact, I would lay odds that the cryptocurrency raised to finance Julian Assange's defense needs to be converted into a state currency at some point, namely dollar, euro, sterling, because the majority of services that are going to be required and have to be bought will only be paid for in that way. So, and you can do that. There is something called Tether, which is what they call a stable coin. And so it's a coin which is fixed to the price of the US dollar. So you can buy tethers at a cryptocurrency, and because it's tied to the value of the US dollar, it's as good as a dollar, apparently, depending on whether you believe Tether is an honest and acceptable organization. And so you could fund money in stable coins like a Tether because you know it can be converted into dollars. But only because you know it can be converted into dollars does this work as money. And there's a lot of complaints about Tether, because when they look at the accounts of the Tether Corporation, we find that only 8% of the Tether's assets to back up all their stable coins are in dollars. The rest are in all sorts of other speculative assets. So if anything goes wrong and there's a big run on selling Tether's coin, stable coin, then Tether will go bust and people will get their money back in fiat currency. So this is a speculative form of money, if it's money at all, and it's really just another financial asset, in my view. This, of course, is strongly attacked by the supporters of cryptocurrencies, who see it as an opportunity to break with the state, to have nothing to do with state currencies, to allow the freedom of the individual to spend his money. All I can say, if the freedom of the individual wants to spend their money, the best thing to do, they want to be free of the state, is probably either to keep the actual commodity you've got that you want, your cow, under your bed, or to put the gold under your bed, with the risk of theft, of course. But that way, you're reasonably guaranteed that the state has nothing to do with it. I'm reluctant to rely on a digital currency to hide my money from the state.
Makes sense. Okay, Esther, please.
Hello, Michael. Thank you very much. I get what you're saying. The principles that you outline and the position that you described with regard to there not being a need for a currency makes sense to me. But it does seem to be highly theoretical in the context of where we are at the moment.
Mm.
And so I think it would be useful to explore some things that might be something that might happen in the meantime. I think that financialization has been a major crippling component to most people's lives. And I think borrowing is something that imprisons people for most of their lives. You've described a scenario whereby people wouldn't need money. So if people were provided with housing, for example, they wouldn't need a mortgage. I think that most people that own a house feel imprisoned by the mortgage for half of their lives. And it's a massive indictment of the society that we live in, that most people are just afraid of their financial position for a large proportion of their lives. So I'd like to explore what sorts of things we might propose as an intermediate path. I'd like to explore a world where there was no borrowing. I saw that somebody in the chat said that borrowing is necessary. I'd like to consider and discuss that. And I think I'd like to discuss that also in the context of how we invest in business without borrowing. Could there be some sort of shareholder cooperative type approach to investing in businesses to make them viable? That's also based on the context that actually, in terms of business, more than 95% of businesses are actually small or medium, yet global corporations comprise the vast majority of turnover, whilst being a very, very small proportion of the number of organisations. Perhaps we just need to do away with those global corporations. So what, Michael, would you see as possible intermediate steps to what you describe, and how might we actually implement the society without borrowing?
Yes, well, I mean, where does borrowing or credit, one man's credit is another woman's debt, but where does credit arise in a modern economy, and not just a capitalist one, but mainly in a capitalist one? And the obvious answer is that whatever you produce in a period of time and convert into whatever money is available may not be enough for you to build, say, a factory or a farm, or produce a farm machine, which costs many thousands, way more than the available earnings from that particular process and period of production. So you need to have extra money or extra credit, because it's credit in that sense. It's money that you get, but you have to presumably pay back. So therefore, it's not like a straightforward transaction. You have to get credit in order to produce and create certain things which enable you to produce more over a period of years. We might call it fixed capital. So it's not what you use up in a production process, in raw materials and inputs and so on to get a product. You need machines, you need factories, you need other money, and that's much more than in one production period, so you need credit. So this is the process by which capitalist production takes place, by borrowing and getting credit being given to you by banks or other lenders. And the circulation of credit is necessary for the process of the capitalist mode of production. How could that disappear? Well, it could disappear in the following way. You made a very good point, Esther, that the vast majority of the turnover and the funds are held by a small number of corporations. Should we break them up? In my view, no, let's take them over. They become part of the state system. So the production that they've got and the resources that they've got in their hands and the employees that work for them become part of the state administration, and they can be directed towards producing all the social production needs that we require in a massive way, and then help small businesses which still exist to be supported in that process. Because rather than being oppressed by a small number of multinationals that dominate each market, they will be supported by state production to produce cooperatives in a certain area, if that was what people wanted to do. And that would mean, in effect, first of all, a large amount of credit would disappear. The financialization of banking, of speculation, of movement of credit would disappear, because it would all be within the state production system, and therefore not require this movement of credit, because it will be available within the state system already. And for those smaller companies, they will get some sort of measure of support and credit over a period of time. Hopefully they will come into the state system, and these smaller companies begin to disappear and be part of the whole process of socialist administration of production and consumption, but over a period of time. So credit, in my view, is a capitalist for entity category. It would gradually disappear with money, but it's necessary. How is that overcome under socialists? Thing, because we actually we put aside a certain amount of our labour time and value produced by the socialist economy to produce things which take longer than one production period. We actually have an investment fund, if you like. We don't need the credit because we make an investment fund within the state system. As Marx said, that the first task is the social investment fund. So what are we going to spend lots of things that require the whole basic infrastructure of an economy to build on? And that's where we have to, first of all, invest. Whatever's left over after that will then be distributed according to begin with people's contribution towards that, for which they would get tokens or they would receive physical goods and services on behalf of their labour time. And over a period of time, eventually, the social fund would become the dominant feature and everybody would receive whatever they needed out of the process. But of course, that's on an international. I've emphasised this for everybody. We're talking about a society which is international, where the world is devoting all its resources in this direction to remove the inequalities in the society, the debtors from the creditors. It's a tremendous transition, which is going to take we don't know how long it would take. We haven't even started. We don't even have one state which can begin that process towards the transition towards socialism and the disappearance of money and credit.
Thank you. Matthew, please.
Hi, comrades. I think there's loads of points on this one. It's great. I think the thing is, we talk about debt. Actually, of course, traditionally, of course, revolutionaries have always been against debt. Whenever we get anywhere near the levers of power, one of the demands we always raise is the question of abolishing debt. As we've seen, obviously, in a number of cases, particularly obviously in Russia. Once the Bolsheviks took power, the first thing they did was we published the treaties and we'll abolish the debt, and they did. And the thing is, obviously, that actually, interesting enough, broke France, because France had more money invested in Russia than any other power, and it actually took out France as a major imperial power, almost as a one-out. It was a very, very interesting effect. But we should absolutely raise this question. We will not honour the debts of the capitalist classes and whatever else. They're not our debts; they're their debts. And if we get rid of them, we're not going to honour the damn things. The other thing I think which is important is that socialism itself is a system of abundance. That there's no reason why there should be a shortage of actual produced goods that are available to people, as a basics. But clearly, as we now exist in a system, in a capitalism of decline and degeneration, it actually is obstructing the productive forces. For a number of reasons. I mean, obviously, they don't want to provide goods to everybody, but the productive forces and capacity is perfectly there to do it. I mean, you could actually provide a reasonable living standard to most of the people in the world without a great deal of effort in terms of the existing technologies, if there was the will to do it. I don't see an issue with that. I mean, this is the problem we've got with capitalism. It is actually, an imposition on humanity itself, but of a tiny, rich minority, essentially blood-sucking off the rest of the population, literally. I think the other thing, of course, is that the other thing that needs to be pointed out, and apart from anything that, the whole, as you say, the evolution of money, is this whole thing, as Marx points out, the questions of money to commodity to money prime, and then the shortening of that by finance capital to money prime, and the actual cutting out of the productive point, and we wind up ever more with this question of the production of what's effectively fictitious capital, where it gets ever more distant from any form of production or any challenge of actually extracting value from the working class. And so we wind up with this big overhang of money, which obviously is producing the kind of crisis and the further crisis we would expect, further collapses we would expect to come. from this this stuff, and things like the advent of derivatives, which are essentially an effort to take profit now from something that may happen sometime in the future, And actually, as Warren Buffett himself, one of the richest men in the world, actually said, well, this is like a bomb under the system. We're actually constructing the destruction of the whole thing in the future by essentially trying to suck out money out of something that might happen, or we're betting on in the future, and therefore, screwing the entire system, and it's actually in a seriously parlous state because of all of that activity. The final thing, of course, I think is should be the banks. I mean, clearly, the thing about 2007, 2008, of course, is that essentially the banks collapsed, all of them. And in fact, the only reason why we have major banks now, I mean, besides obviously what was revealed in 2007, 8, and afterwards, is of course they're all run by crooks. Even under their own legality, these people actually should have all been locked up. And as the Department of Justice in the US said, well, they're too big to jail. They should be in jail, but we're not put them there because obviously then the bloody system would collapse. But the reason why the banks now exist is because they're popped up by the state. There's no other reason for it. Because essentially now all banks are guaranteed by state action, which is an extraordinary position, really. And it did sort of strike me that if you had a decent government, in this country, the first thing you would do is say, right, we're going to nationalise all the banks at no expense, because what we'll do is we'll withdraw the guarantee to maintain the banks. And if they don't want to be nationalised, they can stay out there for half an hour, and then they can be nationalised when they collapse. Because essentially that's where we're at. The whole banking system is now controlled by the state, and it's guaranteed and popped up by the state. And the question is, how is it, really, that we should expose this and say, look, the damn, why are we propping up this thing for the benefit of this tiny handful of crooks? So is certainly a point we should make. Thanks.
Thank you. Michael, do you want to respond?
No, I think Matthew did pretty well there. I don't know if I had nothing to disagree with, really. So fair enough. Maybe I'm looking for something to disagree with.
Disagreeing. Okay, Tony, can you disagree?
Maybe not.
Well, most people disagree with me, so I don't think it will be that difficult.
Oh, surely not.
I've always considered myself a Marxist, but the one area I've tried to avoid is Marxist economics. I have an instinctive understanding, but it's an instinctive, it's not a theoretically worked out. And so I do have a lot of points or questions, really. And maybe you could also confirm one or two things. If I can comment on Esther's remarks about credit not being needed. Credit was essential to the development of capitalism. I mean, if we go back, say, to the 13th century, I mean, I could go back to, say, the York. You will probably may not remember, know about when there was a fairly savage pogrom against the Jews there, and they were all burnt and things like that. But what it really was a peasant revolt, because the Jews lent the money to the peasants to buy their corn or their seed and so on. And that's essential. It was essential in India as well. And of course, they charged high interest rates and they got more and more indebted. And the peasants decided, and this was not just common to England, but to Russia and so on, where you had the same things occur. If you kill all the money lenders and destroy the notes, etc., then you would escape the debt. Of course, the rulers, the King of England, didn't allow that. They decided that they may have got rid of the money lenders, but they owed the king instead. So that actually didn't work. But without credit, I mean, which in essence is a means of producing on the basis of a promise. then capitalism could not work. Yet, one thing you didn't mention, which was also essential to the development of capitalism from the very start, certainly colonialism, was insurance. The very first ships that went out to India, I mean, began the insurance scheme because you didn't know if a ship would actually sink or make it there. So here, there was a scheme whereby you could, in essence, pool the money so that if your investment didn't pay off, then you'd be compensated. Of course, it's now developed into a very sophisticated system. But I mean, that was really the origin in Britain. I don't know elsewhere, but I imagine it's much the same. But I have a number of really questions which are not particularly linked in a sense. Firstly, in the 20s, I think it was a decision of Winston Churchill that Britain would be on the gold standard, so that all trade and all money had to be linked to a fixed quantity of gold. And that caused, if I'm right, massive deflation and austerity, unlimited government expenditure. And that was eventually done away with, I understand, and the Keynesian ideas took over, whereby you weren't constrained simply by the fixed amounts of gold. Was that a political decision, I presume, in the end? I mean, why were they so addicted to the gold standard in the first place? And has that idea disappeared now with the advent of time? I was wondering also on Russia and Venezuela, which you say deposited gold with the US Federal Reserve and have had, or Britain, and have now had it stolen. I've never been able to understand why they would trust the Americans in the first place with their gold, knowing how they behave with their sanctions regimes and their confiscations. What led them to trust the US? Which is an interested party. It's not some kind of neutral guarantor, oblivious about suprastate, as it were. I've never understood it. But also, you didn't mention the role of the dollar as a reserve currency. And many people see that what's happening in Ukraine and elsewhere in the world is an attempt by the United States to maintain its role as the world's currency, which, as I understand it, is the US can basically print as many dollars as it likes to fund its deficit, and the way it enforces that is through its military might, to put it not too bluntly. Do you agree with that? Other things, Keynes. From what I understand about Keynes, I say my economic, I have no economic background. It's the one subject I've never studied at college, university or school, is that in essence you use money, which you say it stores value, in order to produce things which you increase the amount of value, and therefore you give your currency some stability. And I think Hitler did that most successfully, using a guy who was the president of the Reichsbank, Helmut Schacht. In essence, again, they printed money to stimulate production, and that in itself was, if you like, the guarantor of the Reichsmark as a result. Again, could you comment on that? It also seems to me that today we're also moving into an era where we're going backwards, in a sense, with barter, the internet, that countries simply exchange things like oil for wheat or what have you, because that way you get round not least sanctions, of course. And maybe you could also comment, finally, the theory that Mike Kidron, if you remember him, an early international socialist economist, about the role of the permanent arms economy. In essence, the arms are produced in vast quantities, but they're never on the sale on the open market. And so military expenditure acts, if you like, to absorb purchasing power and money, and again stabilizes the system, although it can have inflationary consequences. I don't know whether you came across that and what your opinion was of that.
Well, Tony, what a lot of questions.
I'm sorry.
completely new seminar you've got there several times. Let me just deal with the gold standard first. As you say correctly, that particularly in the 19th century, most states operated currencies that were tied to the gold standard. In other words, the pound was so much, say 10 pounds to the ounce of gold, or in the case of the US in the 20th century, I think it was $45 to the ounce, was fixed. So that meant that if you were getting dollars or you're getting pounds, you knew that it was a certain amount that could be converted into a certain amount of gold, and that gave you some sort of security that the value of this purchasing power of this particular currency was steady. But of course, as you correctly point out, and I mentioned before, there's only a certain amount of gold in the world that can be used to provide that standard. And the only people really who became supporters of the gold standard were the bankers, because the bankers felt that if a currency came off the gold standard and was no longer convertible into gold, but was just convertible into more dollars or more pounds, that's all it could be converted into, or other currencies, then it would lose a connection with the value of something. So if a government defaulted on its bonds, or the economy was going down, that currency would be weak. So if you've been holding all your money in pounds or whatever it was, and you had that crisis in the economy, all your pounds were worth less, and you would no longer be able to convert them into gold, which you thought would give you some security over that process. And the only people who wanted to avoid a devaluation of the currency or inflation of prices as a result were bankers who were lending money to other people. If they lent money in dollars, say 100 million to somebody, and then the value of that dollar collapsed in other currencies, then even if they got the 100 million back, it wouldn't be worth as much as it was when they first lent it. So they wanted something that would stabilize the purchasing power, if you like, the value of these currencies, and that gold provided that. So bankers were hugely in favor of the gold standard. But industrialists and the productive sectors of capitalist economy were not, because it restricted their ability to expand the economy, to get credit in other currencies. If there was only a certain amount of gold, everything had to be fixed towards this anchor of gold. And so it restricted the development of the economy. So when expansion took place, yes, prices may not rise very much, the gold standard would hold that down, but also it restricted the ability to expand production and therefore profitability. So there was a battle between the finance sector, the bankers, the old-fashioned bankers, and the productive capitalists. And as we expanded into the 20th century, and big economies like the US and others wanted to expand faster, and yet they were finding it more difficult to get the sort of a level of value that they could get out of their exports, then releasing the dollar from the gold enabled them, as you say, Tony, to start buying goods and services with dollars, which they could print, to quote, and wouldn't have to be paid back in gold anymore. So it freed up credit, if you like. It expanded the money supply dramatically by taking it off the gold standard, but then it opened up the possibility of inflation. So Keynesianism, which very much in favor of getting rid of the gold standard, and the expansion of fiscal spending by governments and monetary expansion, which became the dominant feature of, particularly in the post-war period, but even before, opened up the possibility of inflationary economies, because in the 19th century, most economies were not inflationary. They had slumps. The gold standard often was associated with big slumps, but it wasn't associated with inflation. And yet in the 20th century, with the removal of the gold standard progressively by different governments, the weaker you got with your economy, the quicker you wanted to get off the gold standard, which held you back. And so that led to the development of more inflationary economies. So now we have expansion of capitalist economies with inflation, because money is being printed and controlled by the state and is not anchored to gold. So the gold standard has its advantages for certain sectors of the capitalist class, and for others, it doesn't have an advantage at all. So that's why it began to disappear. We're now in a different world where production expansion takes place without the anchor of gold on the whole, although there's still that role, particularly at an international level. And when you get crises, then if currencies become unacceptable, the Venezuelan bolivar, nobody wants. The Zimbabwe dollar, I think it is, nobody wants that because the economies are so feeble and weak. Most people, most investors, most businessmen, most bankers prefer, if they have to choose a paper currency, which they do, or a national currency, they prefer the dollar. The dollar seems to them a stable thing. So we think this current crisis between the Russia-Ukraine disaster, we see the collapse of the Russian ruble. Nobody wants the Russian ruble anymore. But everybody on the whole wants the US dollar, even over the euro or the yen and so on. The US dollar is seen as the most secure national currency you can get. Some people want gold. It apparently appears that most people, a very full number of people, don't actually want cryptocurrencies because they've gone down in this crisis because they really are financial speculation of money. So gold goes up, the dollar is stronger against other currencies because it seems to be a safe haven, the safest form of money you can have internationally in crises like that. So that is why the US, although it's relatively been weaker productively in trade and other areas of expansion technology over the last 30 or 40 years, with China coming through, it's still the dominant imperialist power because people see the dollar as the main form of currency for transaction, for storing of value, and for rushing into when other currencies get into trouble. So the dollar acts as a sort of gold standard, if you like. But this time the hegemonic position of the US allows it to use the dollar in this way. So the US, although it's relatively weaker than it was 50 years ago compared to other capitalist powers in terms of production, trade, and technology, it is still strong in two very, very important areas: finance and the power of the dollar, and the fact that reserve currencies, people hold their companies, governments and companies hold their bulk of their money that they've got as a store of value in dollars rather than anything else. That gives it tremendous power. And the other one, as you mentioned, is military power. The US military force and spending is bigger than the whole of the rest of the world's military spending and forces put together. The US imperialist power as a military force is way, way stronger than any other country, including China, including Russia. They're nowhere compared to the US when it comes to the military. Now, is that a way in which the US capitalist economy has, as it were, compensated for the crises that it's got by going into military spending? It's a theory that's been presented, as you said, by Michael Kidron and others about, it must be 60 or 70 years ago when Michael presented that theory, that the argument was back in the 60s and 50s and 60s, that capitalism appeared to be stable, things were going forward, there was full employment, there was no slumps as we saw in the 30s, and the reason was that the governments were spending on military weaponry and boosting the economy and the consumption that way by investing in public money into military spending. Well, actually, a lot of evidence has come since to show that actually that may help military arms producers, but on the whole, a capitalist economy does not benefit from putting money into unproductive areas like military spending and so on. It might be necessary to control the world, but it's not the best way of productively developing capitalism and boosting the profitability of the vast majority of capitalists in any particular economy. So yeah, but there's quite a lot of very good empirical evidence recently to show that the more money spent on military arms, on the whole, is bad news for that economy over time. And that the permanent arms economy theory, I think, has been can be dismissed as a solution for capitalism, if that's what it was originally. It hasn't solved capitalism's crises. I think I've covered as many of the points I can. Yes, barter's back a bit. If you don't fancy any currency at all, then maybe you should just take your money in oil, take your value in oil or wheat, and do some exchanges like that. And That's been happening between China and Russia in the past, but it's still a very small area. I'm afraid it's not a very efficient way of doing things, is it? You still have to value everything in some sort of currency. How much wheat for how much oil? Who's decided by the dollar? So it doesn't really solve the issue, barter. The world can never go back to barter. And in fact, if we look at the evidence of primitive societies, barter wasn't actually that big. It was because people still had some form of universal exchange commodity, like whatever it was, cowrie shells and so on. They didn't just exchange goods one for the other in wider transactions between communities. Barter's a myth, really.
Thank you, Michael. We're picking your brain here, and I would like to pick your brain on the labor vouchers. I think that's quite it's a long history to it, isn't it? Marx wasn't the first one to talk about it. I think Robert Owen and other utopians were trying to set up communities where they would work with labor vouchers. I think it's quite important in terms of, inspiring people to fight for a different system, that we sort of get our head around it. I mean, money isn't, of course, it's not the it's not the root of all evil in that sense. I mean, people say that, but you could do away with money, and if you leave everything else the same, you'd still have inequality, etc. But how to overcome it? I mean, socialism, of course, when we're talking about socialism, communism will be a totally different way of organizing things by need and collectively, etc. So there's a transformation, a transition to that. But the labor vouchers itself, I mean, I think, as I understand it from Proudhon and Owen, etc., they said one hour's work, one voucher, or something like that. Yeah. So the same, it doesn't matter what job you do, it's the time you spend on it and you get the vouchers. They can't be exchanged. So this voucher is just for you. You can't give it to somebody else and somebody hoards all the vouchers. Only you can spend it. I'm not quite sure how they checked up on that, but so that's, let's say like that, you only you can have it. But what about things like if you have to be a surgeon, you have to operate on somebody, there's different skill levels. I think Marx talked about that as well, didn't he? So it's not just the time, but it's the time equivalent to produce something. I can't even quite remember.
The surgeon. So it's the time it's taking to train the surgeon to do that special.
Exactly. So that would be part of the voucher allocation, would it? Is it?
Yeah.
Could you maybe talk about it?
We're in a transitional period here. So if we're going to have vouchers at all, I mean, the first thing to say is Proudhon and Owen were presenting the idea, or Owen presented the idea of vouchers within his cooperative factory. So it's a bit like a tiny molecule of society surrounded by the rest of capitalism. We're going to operate on labour vouchers in Robert Owen's cooperative factory, which he attempted to implement with some degree of success. But we can think of other workers' cooperatives which last for some time, but they're faced with a massive market surrounding them and their ability to survive. So if they're just a tiny molecule in the whole body of capitalism, then they're obviously going to find it very difficult to maintain this socialist molecule in there, if you like. And Proudhon's position was slightly different. He's basically saying that money is not the root of all evil, but the way in which we can really change society for the better. If we can control money, if we have the control of money, a bit like modern monetary theory, really. They say, let's have the control of the issuance of the currency. The state has control. Once we have that, we can actually control the economy, because we can just print as much money or produce sufficient money to buy all the goods and services that are required by people. And the government don't have to worry about taxes, and they don't have to worry about government spending under control, because they control the money supply. This was Proudhon's position. Marx replied and said, well, no, if capitalism still exists, you print the money, but who's going to do the production of the new values that are required from the use of this money? You're going to give it to the capitalists. So you print $100 million. What do? Give it to Amazon to do the distribution? Do you give it to BP Energy to produce the oil? You're not doing anything about them. You're leaving the social structure just as it is now. You're simply printing money and saying, I can print as much and to get BP to produce enough energy that we require. That Marx basically said, that's back to front. What we want is control of the value creating parts of the economy first, bring them under control, bring them under a social organization of cooperative production. So taking the molecule of Robert Owen and converting it into the whole body of social organization. And then the question of production directly for social needs and services can begin, and we can gradually do away with the need to have money at all. So the money is not the solution to the problem. Partly it's not the root of all evil, it's the measure of all evil, right? And what we need is to get rid of the evil, and then the measure of money begins to disappear. So it's the other way round, and that's quite an important thing, because if we believe that things can be solved simply by the state printing money, we're in a dangerous position, because we're deluding ourselves that will change the capitalist system at all. In fact, it would lead to all kinds of dislocations in the capitalist system, which is precisely only make things work for labour in general.
Yeah, thank you. Very important point, I think. Anthony.
Yes. I'll start now. I don't want to go on too much of a tangent and too many things. I lose people with my autism. But I want to talk about the difference between capitalist societies, or what the general workers say in the semi-colonial world. But capitalism is pauperizing the middle class. I mean, what's happened with PIO is very, very instructive. I don't know if people have heard they've just sacked 800 workers just at a drop of a hat.
Yeah.
And that could, and they're also upsetting the trade union bureaucracy. They're treating them the same way they're treating the Russian bureaucracy, provoking them, having no rights, having no discussions. They're absolutely reckless. They're so stupid for their own good. Even Johnson's condemned in Sky News over the anti-union hatred. Murdoch, he's worried because he has to do with Labour government and all sorts of things. We can whop and you plan that for a year, but if the unions have come out, he wouldn't have got away with that. And even he's worried, because this could cause a real upheaval. But it's not just economic. The economic base is important, but I also think there's going to be an important process Friday over that girl Q in Stoke Newington who got sexually abused. There will be mass upheavals over that. It gives the politics the hope. It could take the anti-race, anti-sexist struggle and the working class struggle. Capitalism could be seriously threatened. I mean, you could have an Egyptian type upheaval that sweeps its governments away. I mean, it's not a very stable foundation. But the monetary theory is Keynesianism, as you say. Now, didn't Lenin Trotsky say that social democracy after World War I, and when it became more reformist, was just old utopian socialism anyway, with a more working class base in the trade union movement. And that's basically what that was. But the difference today, I think you could talk about the Belt and Road Project, these contradictions, and the worker states in China, because you don't think it's fully made the transition to capital. You know a lot more about the Chinese economy than me. I don't read a lot of your writings, read more of you. But you could talk a bit about that, because that's not totally done for profit, even in the third world. It's opportunist, because it bows out. It's one thing to undermine imperialism, but they've got the stages to it. They don't want to extend the revolution, because the revolutions extend there. The rocks will be overthrown next. But it builds out. It builds the railways. It builds forests. It builds the rains for the deforestation in Africa, and a whole series of things. And it's trying to read all the roads and railways. A massive dominance of the productive forces. Because Trotsky didn't think in the early days of the Soviet Union, they never let workers come out of that kind of isolation, because it showed an alternative society. So you got Stalinism and the bureaucratic caste. You got it blows out the imperialism, there's clashes with them, and then there's maneuvering in the semi-colony. You could talk about some of that. That's interesting, because even in some of those societies, you haven't got away with money, because you still need money. Even the bourgeoisie talks about in the bourgeoisness of distribution, as you say, to know what's available and to know what you've got. It's bureaucratic corruption in these societies. But they're wiping out a lot of the capitalists down in Russia with the sanctions. Some of them have to go back towards the bureaucracy. And uniting the whole bureaucracy in Russia, like uniting the bureaucracy in this country. Absolutely crazy. They don't rein these people in. They're going to lose a lot of money in the trade with Russia. Russia can move in the third world. I mean, Hansen said with the coconuts, they're more likely to move in the third world than the imperialist countries, because the social revolution in the imperialist countries will be overthrown. But they can use I'll finish here, the bargaining in the semi-colonies to get concessions. And it's all that maneuvering. And capitalism, they don't want capitalism to go, but capitalism's so weak. One or two snaps of even by them could finish it off. They're in a very weak state. Communism could treat the world, the middle class. I've talked about. There are other things we could talk about some of those. I'll leave it there.
Okay, thanks, Anthony. You pack so much into your contributions. Maybe concentrate on one point or something. Thank you, Conrad. Did you want to say something, or shall we have another
I
contribution?
think it's take no contribution. That was Anthony covered so many subjects there. I
You
can't.
did. Okay, Paul. Hi.
Hello, Michael. I was interested in Tina's last point actually about the voucher system.
Yeah.
Robert Owen, you mentioned somebody else's name, and then I thought, then I suddenly realised, well, when you talked about what somebody would need to control the money system, and you said, well, we'd have to be careful because it rather depends on who sort of controls it, but that is largely why I'm against one idea that's quite popular within the what I would call the soft left is the idea of a universal basic income that replaces most current state benefits, or that's the principle behind it. But I think if you introduce that without actually changing the other structures of the economy, my own view is that all a universal basic income would do is get swallowed up by everybody's existing costs. So I would like to know what your view on the UBI is.
Very interesting question, Paul.
Very good point, Paul. In fact, it's very relevant to this discussion because what is the supporters of universal basic income are generally trying to say, look, we need to improve the incomes of the poor. We need to raise the level of money income for the majority of the population to a level that's decent. So governments should provide that basic support for everybody, whether they're working or not, whatever their problem is, that they need a basic income in order to survive, and this will get rid of poverty. Now, and that should be a major plank of any socialist campaign group, and Labour government, socialist government, or whatever. Well, it sounds a good idea, but I think Paul summed up the argument against it. It doesn't really change, as I said before, with modern monetary theory. It doesn't change the social structure of the economy. It means that capitalists combines and the banks and all the other institutions of capitalism controlling finance, capital, and productive have not been touched. All that we're saying, the supporters of this, is that we need to transfer some of the money they've got by the government through taxation or whatever into a form of basic income. Now, we already have a sort of welfare social security system in most advanced capitalist economies. So it's really the same principle of a certain level of redistribution of the available revenues held by the owners of the means of production and by workers in their wages. They make a contribution towards universal basic income for all. And in many countries, some countries where it's been actually applied, the aim is actually to get rid of other welfare benefits and replace them with the UBI. So it doesn't really make a big difference. And the sort of level of UBI that we require to have decent living standards for the majority of population is way above anything that any capitalist government or social democratic government is prepared to apply. They would never agree to it. And I think, and this is why it's relevant to this discussion on money, is that it sums up exactly what we should do instead. Instead of universal basic income, we need universal basic services. That is the point. What we need is control of the means of production so that we can produce all those things that I said are non-priced, that don't require you get them by having to pay money, whether it's health and education to some extent now, but also all the other things like transport, communications, and other basic needs could be provided without a price. They come as part of government basic services delivered by your socialist government on behalf of the community as a whole. And so if you do that, and that can only really be done through a plan and through control of the major sectors of the economy as part of that plan, then UBI doesn't become an issue. It's not really part of the process that is necessary. UBI, as I think somebody just said, is a distraction from the problems. It's trying to say, look, we can't get rid of capitalism, so maybe we can do something with UBI to help things for the majority of the population. But that is not the answer, because we're not really dealing with the kernel of the problem, just in the same way as printing money would not solve the problem. So UBI on its own would not solve the problem. And I'm sure supporters of UBI saying, well, we understand that, but at least it's something, and we still support socialism as well. But it's like saying, yes, well, it's something, but why shouldn't we be concentrating, as somebody said, rather than be distracted by that, to look at universal basic services and develop them beyond where the very limited universal nature that they are at the moment.
Very true. I mean, it is. I have heard it said, you know, that at least people don't suffer poverty now and don't, you know, have to go to the food bank if they got enough money to feed themselves. It won't solve the problem of poverty, that's for sure.
The food bank is just about the worst universal basic service I can think of.
Indeed. Okay, Kevin is trying to speak, I believe, but I'm trying to bring you in, but you need to accept being made a panelist. Alternative, if that doesn't work, you can just speak now. Kevin? Kevin, can you hear us? No, I don't think it's working. Sorry. Okay, is there anybody else who would like to speak and who can speak and use their microphone? Otherwise, I suggest we are now, if you are able to sum up a little bit. I mean, you've done a lot of talking, but so we very much appreciate it. But 5 minutes summing up or something would be great.
Not even that, I'm sure. Thanks very much for all the questions. Some of them were difficult and complex. I hope I've provided some discussion for us to think about, even if I didn't get it right. But the main point with this discussion is to note that we don't need money in a socialist society, but a socialist society is a long way away, and therefore money would not disappear overnight. We can't abolish it, even if we got rid of our capitalist governments now and united in a world socialist federation of governments. That would just be the beginning of the development towards socialism. So we have a long way before we get to the idea of the abolition of money. But a discussion like this at least explains to us the difference between the way a capitalist economy works, which is production for profit, for selling on markets for money, as opposed to production for social need without having to sell on markets for money. That's the alternative way of organizing human society, which will be for the benefit of the many, not the few, which is what we have at the moment.
And I'm really sorry, if you can still carry on, we've had 2 more people who've just put their hand up.
Right, well, I'm not repeating my summing up again.
No, we can cut that out and put it at the end later. Okay, Steve, you haven't spoken yet.
Steve.
Yes, hi there, Michael.
Hi.
I'm not an advocate of universal basic income, but I've got a but to this, which is I think we have to look at it as to what it actually is.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, obviously, it's not an abolition of the wage labour, therefore it's not an abolition of capitalism. It seems to me it's a kind of socialisation of wages in a way, in the way that pension is. Because we have universal pensions and we're not working and we're getting some sort of income from the state, which enables us to live. Now, we wouldn't say, well, you know, pensions don't abolish capitalism. Well, of course they don't. But nevertheless, we would fight for a decent pension for everybody when they've retired and things of that type.
Mm-hmm.
And in a sense, the wage system, you've got a private wage that your employer gives you, and you've got a social wage, which is part of that. Now, that social wage could be the NHS, free healthcare, which, of course, we know we're paying for, obviously, and free education. So there always is a social wage. And that's because the working class has tried in its struggle to socialise some of the services that they get and have them provided more collectively. And in the case of the NHS, you've sort of got a partial abolition of the law of value, but it isn't really, because although you're getting a free service, somebody's measuring how much resources are going into the NHS. There is a, it's not just like open, is it? There is a way of measuring education, a way of measuring all those things. So although I'm not advocating universal, I'm still thinking about this idea, but I don't know that we should set it up as a kind of, let's say, a bogeyman in that way. In other words, it's not getting rid of capitalism. It's not getting rid of wage labor. It's kind of changing the form of it. It's a kind of struggle that working people might have to try to make the idea of the income that we live on is more socialized and not a purely private thing that an employer has to give you. You know what I mean? So it sort of slightly undermines capitalism in that sense, you know, that we're not just dependent on McDonald's for our income. There is something else which is coming from the social product, as it were, the surplus that's being distributed in our way. Now, of course, if we got a basic income, it might just be inflated away and be worth peanuts, you know. So obviously that wouldn't be the end of the story if we had that thing. So I don't want to advocate it, but I don't know whether we really have to look at it as a kind of reformist kind of project, but not necessarily something that asks people to say, is a private wage by a private employer the only thing we can have to live off in our lives under capitalism?
Well, no, I sympathise with the opposition, Steve, because and you think your analogy of the pension, the state pension is a good one. In a way, UBI is a sort of extension of the state pension or social benefits in money form, which will be given or handed out to people by the government, which has to, obviously, that has to be raised from resources from borrowing or from taxation and so on, in order to redistribute what's available income in the economy. And as you know, with pensions, it was a great reform of the early 20th century that we actually had state pensions set up by a Liberal government originally, I think pre-First World War. But we know, look at the state of state pensions. It's not a solution, is it? It's something you would fight for because it's something which improves the conditions for people who are no longer working. And UBI, in that sense, is similar to that pension, but it won't solve the overall problem of the inequality of income and wealth, as I'm sure you agree. You understand that perfectly well. And the only problem we have with UBI is it's sometimes presented quite often at the moment as the thing to do, when I would say that the thing to do is to gain control of basic services under public ownership and control of society, so that we can expand those free services that you talk about that we have limitedly at the moment in health and education, to a whole area of other basic needs. And that is a big, powerful demand that the labour movement can make, which is very effective in terms of what it would deliver, much more than UBI, but also it explains to the population as a whole the different way of organising our society. UBI says this is the way our society is organised under capitalism. We're just going to take a little bit more share of what they produce and the way they do it. Universal basic income is saying we're changing the whole way in which we organise it, because basic services will be free at the point of use. You would say perhaps, well, we can have both. Well, maybe, we have pensions already, but I think we need to be striving forward to go to something more radical that will really transform the lives of the population.
Thank you, Michael. Tony's got another question, or 10, I presume.
not quite. Not quite 10, but a few.
I know he hasn't studied that Master Economics, and now he's using me to.
I am, Michael. I'm sorry for that. I'm exploiting your labour power. I apologise for that. It seems to me, just commenting briefly on pensions, they were always, the idea was that they were deferred wages.
Yeah.
Until, of course, someone like Robert Maxwell comes along and steals the lot.
They were private ones, yeah.
Yes. What I've never been able to get my head around, this universal basic income, it seems to me another attempt, and there have been many attempts, to have a kind of ideal form of capitalism, whereby you have small producers, you have consumers in equilibrium with each other. But what they miss out is the very nature of capitalism, which is that it's exploitative. It exploits people's labour and therefore produces profit. So it's a kind of almost feudal socialism, this idea of a mythical ideal past projected into the future. I don't know whether you agree with that, but the Green Party, for instance, are very hot on it, because they don't want to abolish capitalism. They want to reform capitalism or change it into a system which is equitable, if you like, for everyone. But it misses out things like the tendency towards monopolization. So you actually have bigger and bigger concentrations of capital. So possibly you can comment on that. One thing you didn't comment on amongst my plethora of questions was why Venezuela and Russia store their gold with the US Federal Reserve. I don't understand it, but maybe there's something I'm missing in my understanding. On the digital currencies, the Bitcoin and so on, it seems to me they have no value in themselves. They're based on the blockchain, and as Matthew said, using incredible amounts of electricity.
Yeah.
But it strikes me as this kind of giant Ponzi scheme, which sooner or later is going to come down crashing. Because I mean, that's why you have these vast fluctuations in price, because there is no inherent stability in that system. Maybe again I'm missing something, but I do ask you. But could you also comment on the question of the US as reserve currency? Because many people argue that one of the causes of the present military offensives is the desire of the United States to preserve its role as a reserve currency, because it allows it to fund, for example, a massive military. And therefore, with China increasingly using the renminbi as opposed to the dollar, and Russia may well be going into that system, and other countries, Iran, for example, Venezuela, that the US finds that through, if you like, financialization, there is a greater and greater challenge to its world role, and its economy won't be able to sustain a military, which, as you say, is bigger than every other country put together. Possibly you have some views on that. I don't know.
Well, on the question of Venezuela and other countries, including Russia, who've kept their gold outside their country, these governments and central banks that run the gold reserves in these countries, bankers, actually believe that they're all honest and that it's perfectly okay for the Federal Reserve to look after their gold because they don't have to transport it across boats and all the other things over to wherever it should in their own country. And so they don't ship it away. The Federal Reserve or whoever's holding the gold for them, the Bank of England, in the case, I think, of Venezuela, don't you worry, we're very honest people, it's in your vault, it's got your label on it, Venezuela, don't worry, you're absolutely fine. Some governments have moved their gold. Russians moved some of their gold into China. Chinese are holding some of the Russian gold reserves and so on. But they've missed a trick, haven't they, Tony? They've been done in. This is unprecedented what the NATO imperialist allies are doing now in terms of financial sanctions, of taking central government banks' reserves and stealing it. This is unprecedented. Apart from Iran and Venezuela, a major economy, a G20 economy, Russia, with sizable reserves, have had them pinched by bankers who are supposed to be reasonable people, international bankers, kick to the rules. Nonsense. It's an example of what has happened. It's an unprecedented event. So when you ask me, why has this happened? Well, I don't think anybody expected it to happen. So it's really a big development that we haven't seen before. I won't discuss UBI. I think I've just discussed that already. I think we can go around and think about that a bit more. Just to say on the reserve currency, which again we mentioned before, I think the US has what do we mean by reserve currency? It means, as I said before, governments, institutions, companies tend to transact a lot of their activities in dollars, mainly because dollars have become a dominant currency around the world as the US economy expanded during the 20th century. And they've held a lot of their reserves in dollars because, as I said, they've seen it as the safest currency of all the currencies because of the size of the US economy. There's no way the US government is not going to honor the dollar. That's the view. While the Venezuelan, Zimbabwean governments might not honour their currencies, and so it's better to keep your money in dollars, so it becomes a reserve currency. So you don't keep all your money in gold, that gets pinched anyway, it seems, but also you don't keep it in dollars in your reserve currency, but you keep it in dollars mainly in your reserve currency. There has been transfers to euros and yen to some extent, remember, but dollars is still 68% of all the world's central bank reserves are held in dollars. So the dollar is the big reserve currency, which gives a certain advantage to the US, as you said, Tony, to carry out transactions because they know the dollar has that power and they have control of the printing of that.
Is it declining though?
Yeah, only very slightly. I know there's a lot of talk in the media about, US is declining as a reserve country. Not much at all. I'm telling you, this crisis only increases the position of the dollar as a reserve currency, in my view. It's not going to, it's declined a little. But just as the financial sector of the US is still very strong, although it's not as strong as it was, it's still very, very strong. And its military sector is very, very strong. So the currency remains as the strongest currency. Where it's weak, where the US has declined, is in manufacturing, in trade, in technology, and so on, relatively to other countries like Europe, Japan, and China. But the currency remains strong. There's talk amongst left, so the reserve currency of the dollar is going to collapse. No.
Thank you, Michael. And we've got one more speaker, and I think then we wrap it up, which is Zabinia.
It's my dinner, everybody.
I know. Last speaker from the floor. Thank you, Michael, for indulging us. Hi, comrade.
Yes, so thank you very much. I'd like to follow up this discussion with a debate with Michael and on the energy for energy economic approach and I think I mentioned this in the past, the capital nature and the unfinished critique of political economy, Marx's Eco-Socialism by Koei Sato, that book.
Oh yeah.
And the fact that your definition that Marx value of commodities comes from human labor, socially necessary labor to produce a community, is challenged by energy economics by saying, well, it also needs energy to produce the energy for the muscles to move of that human person.
Yeah.
And considering the history of economics being, muscle energy followed by wood, charcoal, coal, etc., then steam and oil and gas. So and whatever, solar next. So I wonder. I mean, I'll put this right at the end, but I think it needs a separate debate. And I think we could ask Tim Watkins from the Consciousness of Sheep blog to have a debate with you. That'd be lovely. Okay.
Well, that's fine. I'm happy to do that. And for the rest of you who don't know what we're talking about, is that the argument is that energy is a creator of value just as much as human labor, and that's left out of the equation. Same argument presented. Nature is the source of value, not just human labor. Marx actually answered this question as well, and other people have done since on the question of energy, and I'm not going to do that because that would take, as you said, probably an hour of debate, and we probably wouldn't resolve it there.
Thank you very much for that. I think nature does create some value, but that is a different
yes, it does. Yeah.
That is a different issue, and perhaps we can discuss it some other time when you've had your dinner, etc. Thank you very much for joining us for such a long time and answering all our questions. I thought it was a really interesting session that goes some way to explain how we could transition to socialism, how we would organize, and that indeed we don't need money, but that question is very intrinsically linked to changing the way society works, that we don't production for need, etc., that we're changing the whole production system and don't just tinker on the edges. And I think you made those points very clearly against MMT as well, that we need to actually get to the bottom of how things are produced and who's controlling the means of production, etc. Thank you very much, Michael. Thank you very much, comrades, for coming along and asking the questions.
My head is buzzing, but thank you very much for the questions.
Thank you. Enjoy your dinner.